I'm Yvonne Hamoud, registered social worker and owner of New Moon Counseling, but out of the office, I'm a mom, wife, daughter, sister, and friend. Join me each week as I sit with a special guest to discuss everyday things that impact our mental health. We'll be chatting about everything from mental health and relationships to media and current events, as well as personal experiences and reflections, all in the hopes of normalizing our humanness and helping you see that you're not alone. This is Outside the Therapy Room. Hi everyone, welcome back to Outside the Therapy Room. Today we are joined by Jenni. Welcome back.
Hello everyone, happy to be here, thanks.
Yes. Our conversation today is about conflict, and we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how conflict is kind of viewed in a very negative way. A lot of clients that come into the office, or even ourselves sometimes, are either really uncomfortable with conflict, or we're really, I'm sure you have experienced this too, as you have been in your internship and experiencing, client stories. But there is a lot of clients that come in, like, I don't want to fight, we don't want to have any conflict anymore. And that's not always realistic. Mm-hmm. So I thought maybe we would start a little bit by talking about this negative view of conflict and how conflict can sometimes be a positive thing, depending on how it's done.
Yeah, well, and I think what you just said there at the end is really the crux of it, that folks that want to avoid conflict or are really deeply uncomfortable with it, just want to have it done, likely have lived out so many instances of witnessing maybe their parents or experiencing it themselves or other people in their life having very destructive conflict. Mm-hmm. And I think about something that a therapist once told me many years ago, that conflict is necessary, but suffering is not. So
yeah.
It's in the how do we do conflict? But yeah, conflict happens. That's just every time anyone has a sense that they need something to change, and that's not an agreed upon sense, that's going to create conflict. So it's actually an evolutionary process of change. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it needs to happen. It's how we do it so it doesn't become destructive and hurtful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think we definitely require conflict, and it can be so... sometimes conflict comes up when we want to communicate something that's important to us. Mm-hmm. So sometimes the anger, the emotions that we feel around conflict is necessary for us to be able to communicate what it is that we're needing, and injustice that we're feeling, unfairness, or whatever it could be that's coming up in that moment. But definitely figuring out how to fight fairly and how to have positive conflict is really important. But I do like what you mentioned, conflict and over suffering, I guess.
Yeah, we don't need to suffer, but we do actually have to have hard conversations. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you speak to anger too, that one's another tricky one, because a lot of folks want to avoid anger because the association with anger, again, is destructive anger as opposed to productive anger. Mm-hmm. But yeah, anger is a natural feeling, and not something we can avoid eliciting in others that we especially are very close to sometimes.
Yeah. So what are some misconceptions of conflict that you can think of, besides the big one that we just mentioned?
Misconceptions of conflict. Yeah, just off the top of my head, that conflict is bad, conflict is wrong, conflict is an indication that the relationship's not well or that it's unhealthy. That we can avoid conflict. I think that one is a misconception too.
Yeah.
And then I do think that there's likely some misconceptions about conflict as well that we can talk about as we go through the hows of how to do conflict.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. As you were speaking, something that came up was, I think it was in a movie, but like a couple being like, oh yeah, we don't fight at all. And sometimes that being like, ooh, what do you mean you guys don't fight at all? Like, how do you two people can't always be agreeing on the same thing. And I think with conflict, it can be a positive way to understand what each person wants and needs. And then it's the respect and the follow through of meeting each other's needs in that way. But I don't know why that just randomly popped into my head.
Yeah, well, it seems to kind of be like this goal in some kind of pop culture references that you want to be the couple that never has conflict. And when I hear that from folks, I've heard it from a few folks in the past, it always makes me want to be a fly on the wall of their kitchen, because I'm like, what are you doing on the inside?
Everything all the time?
Or is there suppression happening or avoidance? Like, what's going on? It does make me curious.
Oh my goodness, me too, to be a fly on the wall there. So you mentioned the hows of conflict. So what are some of the hows of conflict, or what is the how of conflict?
So there's a lot of different approaches out there, and there's a lot of folks that work on talking about and teaching about conflict that I'm going to draw upon in this. But I think one of the biggest things that sticks out to me on conflict is understanding the role that emotional regulation plays into how destructive a conflict can become. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of speaking to, are we calm inside ourselves? Yeah. Even if we're angry, that's not necessarily an indication that we're in the red, but it depends, like if you're actively feeling dysregulated, and by that I mean your nervous system is out of your, what Dan Siegel would call window of tolerance, yeah, which we could talk about briefly. Essentially, the window of tolerance is a space where you can operate in, you have access to your creative thinking, you have access to your rational mind, you're feeling generally calm. Depending on the person and their experiences, this could be a broad space that they exist in. They can experience a lot of things in the day and still maintain their window of tolerance. Or for some folks who have experienced a lot of really hard stuff in life, that window of tolerance might be quite small, actually. So they need to do a lot of self-regulation practices, take a lot of that space for themselves and their self-care to stay in that space of feeling like somewhat regulated. Mm-hmm. Being pushed out of that is where we talk about, fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. So you're either being pushed into like an overactive state where maybe you're lashing out, or you're really angry, or running away, like leaving, slamming doors, things like that.
Like hyper-arousal.
Hyper-arousal, that's right. And then the opposite is hypo, so just like sinking into kind of more of a depressive state or an avoidant state, freezing up, fawning to appease someone. So we could talk about that more, but the idea is that our nervous system has a state where we can stay regulated, and we're capable of drawing upon different aspects of ourselves and our brain when we're in that space. Yeah. If we get pushed out of that space, or we push ourselves out of that space, everything's offline. Yeah. So if we're in fight, freeze, flight, or fawn, we're no longer accessing, our ability to think creatively. And I think what happens in a lot of conflict is that we get pushed out of our window of tolerance because there's high stakes when we care about someone. So yeah, I think the how for me really starts with noticing when I'm in a conflict, am I regulated right now? Am I in my window of tolerance? Is my whole brain still online? And the ways that I notice that are looking for cues of anxiety or shutdown. Like, are my palms sweating? Is my mind blanking out? Is there a million thoughts racing? Like, as you get to know yourself and your nervous system, you start to realize whether you go more hypo, which is that shutdown, or hyper, which is that really high activation. Yeah. And learning those cues will help you notice when you're in a regulated state. And kind of the biggest takeaway for me so far on conflict is like, don't try to do conflict when you're dysregulated or the other person's dysregulated, because we're not going to get anywhere, and we're likely going to get triggered really fast, and things can escalate really quickly when we're already upset.
Yeah, and I think as you were mentioning that, the reflection, being able to kind of reflect and really tune into how am I feeling? How's my body feeling in this moment? Because I think I'm sure we can all come to a time when there was conflict in our own lives where maybe we either shut down, so the hypo, or we tried to fight back in some way, which is the hyper-arousal. And a lot of that depends on what triggered us in that moment. It could be what the conflict was about, what the other person said. And so it's really important to be able to understand what some of those triggers are in that moment, or at least to just do a quick reflection on where am I in my window of tolerance, and what do I need right now to be able to get back to that regulated state. And sometimes when we're in conflict, depending on how, and I find this too, both in and out of my work, is what am I trying to do with conflict right now? A lot of the times people are trying to win the argument or win the fight or the conflict. And so the way that they are handling that situation is a little bit more in the hyper, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more pushy to try to win the argument. But that's not what we're trying to win here as a team together, to be able to work towards things. But I do think it's important to kind of have that opportunity to reflect. And sometimes that reflection, I think we build it into a habit, right? So at the beginning of this brand new for you, being able to reflect after the fact, being able to go back and be like, ooh, I was in conflict yesterday or a few days ago or a few hours ago. What did I feel? Because it's a lot harder sometimes in the moment to be able to be like, ooh, 1 second, let me go and reflect and, go inward, because we are in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn state already. So just getting into the habit of just doing a quick check-in.
Yeah, I like that. Just checking in and monitoring your state. And I want to like reflect another space that folks go to. So you're speaking to like this idea that we can win this argument. And I think with any, especially close relationships, and folks who may have heard me on the last podcast know I'm fairly politicized. So this is different than when you're trying to politically win something. Yes, that's a different thing, right? So the stakes are higher, they're different, depending on which relationship you're in conflict with. But when we talk about people we trust and love, if you're trying to win, that means they're gonna lose. And you don't want people you love to lose. That's not a good feeling. So that hyper state where people can become aggressive because they're trying to win, and honestly sometimes people are just trying to win a sense of safety or validation or being seen. Like it's not always bad things we're trying to win. It's just how we're going about it is destructive. But the other thing that happens that can be really triggering is when folks go into the, I just want this to end. That's a hypo state. So, let's say your partner comes to you and is like, hey, can you like do better on XYZ? And you feel triggered, you want to defend yourself, then all of a sudden you're fighting, and then you're like, hey, I just want out of here. But you're not communicating anymore and you're shutting down and withdrawing. That can be equally as triggering for somebody as aggression can be. So it's like withdraw, shut down is also pretty destructive in conflict. So noticing what our go-to is also pretty fascinating. Is my go-to to attack and get loud or big? Is my go-to to like start looking everywhere around the room except at my partner or at the person I'm in conflict with, to start backing away, like minimizing their feelings.
And I think it might change depending on who the conflict is with.
Absolutely.
But Sue Johnson talked about in her emotional focused therapy, talks about the pursuer and the withdrawer. And a lot of the times what Sue Johnson found was that in every relationship, there are moments where one partner is a pursuer and the other partner is a withdrawer, and sometimes they switch. And I think, again, in those moments, somebody's being activated because the pursuer is trying to get information, is trying to problem solve the situation, or feels a strong need to go back to a safety regulated state in the relationship, and is actively wanting to, let's solve this, let's figure it out, let's have this conflict and get to a solution at the end. Whereas the withdrawer may be really impacted by that and may be shutting down and may be more in that hypo arousal state. And so yes, it can cause the pursuer to then increase what their need is. And so they might be louder and more aggressive and really more pushy on the conflict, and the withdrawer is just going to withdraw even more. And so it is really helpful to be able to identify, who am I in certain situations? Am I the pursuer? Am I the withdrawer? How is that helpful in this conflict or in the situation? And how am I feeling? Why is this happening? So just that curiosity around it.
I love that you brought that up, this idea that we sometimes flip our strategies and how the strategies will impact the strategy of the other person too, sometimes polarizing. And it reminds me of something that I like to speak about if I do any kind of workshops on conflict is Thomas Kilmann's conflict styles. Because some of the work that Thomas and Kilmann did on conflict styles is looking at what kind of style we tend to inhabit in certain circumstances. And one of the reasons I like it is it's not explicitly about, say, romantic relationships or really close relationships, because we might adapt different strategies in conflict depending on who we're in conflict with, like a boss or an acquaintance or a friend. And that kind of a more aggressive, trying to take control of the situation is considered kind of more of a competing style, where the person wants to come in, they really feel like they know what needs to happen here, and they're trying to like fix it
Yeah.
really fast. And like, that's not necessarily always productive. Great in like first aid scenarios for someone to take control, not with your partner or your, good friend.
Yes.
And then that one often plays off of what we would call either the accommodating or the avoiding type. So those are two other responses.
Mm-hmm.
The avoider tends to like withdraw, totally turtle, like, oh my God, conflict, I'm scared, I'm gonna shut down, my mind's gonna go blank, and I'm just gonna avoid that. This is not even happening. Maybe I'm gonna hang up the phone, or I'm gonna leave the room and never return to this conversation. Yeah. And that will elicit even more pursuing on that part of the person that's feeling like really activated. The other one is the accommodator, the one that might go right to fawn, like, I'll fix it for you. Okay, whatever you want. I'll just agree. I just want this to be over, right? Yeah. So those three types are all really activated styles, but in different ways. Mm-hmm. And then the other two styles that they talk about are compromising or collaborating. And I love that they differentiate between these two things. Yeah, because you can sense the difference between compromise versus collaborate, right? Yeah. And like folks that can collaborate, that's a high level skill, right, in conflict. And it's something that I love to talk to folks about, is like, how do we get to collaboration stage in conflict? And that's when you really see yourselves united against the issue. And then you can get do together. Again, have to stay regulated to have that creative brain on board though. Yeah. So that's a challenge in itself that we could talk about. Yeah. When collaboration just isn't possible though, and it isn't always possible, then maybe we might accept compromise, which means we lose a little and we get a little, but it allows us to move past that moment. So yeah, different styles at different times, not always all bad or all good, but it is interesting how we elicit things in each other as well.
I love those three that you mentioned, because I can see myself going into all three parts depending on what the situation is and who is the person that I'm having that conflict with, right? Like, I think, we turtle sometimes when we're feeling that need for safety. We can become more aggressive if we feel really, really strongly about whatever the conflict thing could be. And sometimes I have found, in order to just avoid that conflict, I'm like, sure, whatever you want, let's just do it. And sometimes in those moments, it's, I just want this to be done, I'm tired, like, let's get this done and over with. Or this doesn't really, that maybe goes more into the collaboration maybe of okay, I don't care either way, I'm just done fighting. You take the win and I'm gonna, like, that's fine. But it's those three different conflict styles. I'm sure all of us can resonate at least a little bit with one of, or all of them, I mean. Just, it kind of just depends on the person, the situation. Like, there's so many factors of how we behave in different conflicts, who we're with, all of that.
Yeah, and some of them are helpful in certain moments, but aren't helpful in others. So like, for example, your experience with becoming accommodating, for example, when you're just exhausted with an argument or whatever and you just want it to be done, it's so understandable. And we need to pay attention to what we're being accommodating on, because if it's a small inconsequential thing, really, like the issue is not that big, it doesn't impact yourself or your sense of self that much to be accommodating towards it. Like, fine, I will take out the garbage tonight, who cares? Like, that's a good one to be accommodating on. If it's like, I don't ever want your mother-in-law to sleep here, like, don't want her to visit, that might not be something you actually want to be accommodating on. And if you're accommodating because you're just exhausted from the fight, that's actually just going to prolong this this fight. It's going to crop up later because the issue's too big, actually.
Yeah, it is really cool to kind of see those different conflict styles.
Yeah, that's something I like to work with folks on. You know, there's a little questionnaire that goes with Thomas Kilmann conflict styles, so we can like go through it together and discuss what styles arise for us. And sometimes people are really surprised. Like, the first time I did it, I was shocked. I will admit, I came up high on competing or aggressive, and I was like, what? I thought I was a collaborator through and through. So to find out that my go-to when I feel threatened is to just get ahead of it and tell everyone I know what's what, the more I reflect on it, I was like, that actually tracks. And then starting to see where that's not serving my best interest or the best interest of the people I love. So it's starting to work on that and figure out where that's coming from and why that's a go-to kind of protective style to adapt.
Yeah,
It's
but
interesting.
there's that curiosity in it again, though, because I'm sure when you are able to be curious about it, you're able to tie it as to why you take on
Yes.
that conflict style, right? And so it is like, this is what I feel is best. I need to communicate this very loudly. I feel very strongly about this. And so I think our conflict styles are helpful. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. I don't think we've mentioned that at all. Like, we are not saying if anything, we're saying conflict is quite healthy, and understanding our style just helps us understand ourselves a little bit more and how we can handle conflicting situations maybe a little bit better, especially in those important relationships. But it is really interesting to kind of be curious about it and see like, ooh, okay, this makes sense. I can be compassionate with myself that right now I'm a little heightened because this thing is really important to me, or because I'm not feeling seen or heard, so I feel like I need to be louder in this moment. And so I love that curiosity that we can kind of have with our conflict styles.
Yeah, and getting curious about, especially in intimate relationships, being curious about ourselves and our partner's experiences in conflict, because the styles we adapt, whether we're becoming more anxious or more avoidant, or we're becoming, competing and aggressive or accommodating or withdrawn, like, they tend to point to core wounds, core beliefs, things that have happened before, core needs, I think, especially, like, needs for safety and control. They get curious about, like, why do I feel like I have to control the situation? Like, that's,
Ooh, that's a big one for me.
Right? Yeah. And curiosity is kind of a doorway into that, and that's something that I can't remember who speaks to it. I'm sure the Gottmans probably talk about it, but like, curiosity is the foundation, I think, for coming to an understanding of ourselves and the people that we're in conflict with, and it's such a necessary part of developing understanding. Like, and we can't be curious when we're really upset, like when we're out of our window of tolerance, or I've heard it referred to as being flooded, like when we're flooded with stress hormones and cortisol, we're no longer able to be curious, and curious is actually like a really foundational part of conflict resolution.
It is. I think being curious is really important in a lot of other areas too, but one thing you mentioned brought up my question of what is actually happening to us when we are out of our window of tolerance. I feel like we talked about it, right? Like, our logical brain is not activated. We are very much in our emotional mind, and that shuts off different things. So what is happening to us in our brain, in our bodies, when we are triggered or when we are in a state of conflict?
Yeah, so I find the biology of conflict super interesting, because we do know this from studying it to be true. So when we're really highly activated, our limbic system, the part of us that's regulating emotions, like really, really activated, there's a lot going on. What happens in that moment is that it literally flips our prefrontal cortex offline. So, and that's because when we're in actual predatory situations, when as humans, we were living lives where we're under threat often, we needed to have this superpower where we perceive a threat. Okay, saber-toothed tiger is gonna eat me. So like, I don't actually need to spend time thinking about the situation or problem solving. I just need to run, or I just need to fight. So it's something that's built into us evolutionary, where if there's a threat, our prefrontal cortex, our problem solving, our rational mind, our curious mind, all flips offline. All that's left is reptile brain, our like full brain stem, the very, very basic part of our biology. That's what's on board. And so that is telling us fight, run, which is flight, freeze up and play dead, or try to appease whatever's going on, which is kind of a newer one folks are talking about now called fawn, right? So literally our biology is making it so the only options available to us when we're that flooded is to run away, to fight harder, to roll over and play dead and freeze up, or to try to like fawn over the other person. None of those strategies are going to actually resolve an emotional conflict. Great survival strategies.
For sure.
Not so great when you're like actually just trying to talk about like chores. So like, I find it very interesting that this evolutionary trick that's kept us alive actually now kind of gets in the way because, and this plays back to our attachment systems when we're really little and we learn, how to feel safe in relationship and what emotional safety feels like. If things have happened as we're growing up where conflict feels definitely just emotionally unsafe, when you're a child, emotional unsafety is actually a survival threat. Because you need to have your parents' desire to feed you and take care of you, right? So like to be in an emotionally unsafe environment feels like a direct survival threat. We maintain that part in our brain now. So when someone threatens us emotionally, our brain still goes, oh my God, saber-toothed tiger. And then we can't problem solve. So that's where that noticing of like, are my palms sweaty? Is my heart rate up? That is the indication of your prefrontal cortex is no longer on board, which means you're not going to be able to collaborate, you're not going to be able to be curious or creative or problem solve together. So that's the time to take a break.
Being able to catch ourselves in the moment to take a break. Yes, that's really important. I feel like sometimes we're in the survival mode, and because we are stuck on surviving, it's so primal that we'll do anything just to survive, and that's when those 4Fs come in, right? And to be able to kind of take a step back and be like, ooh, I need to take a break. It's easier said than done because our body is so activated in that moment just to survive, and so we really need to slow things down. I think, again, our bodies are so connected to our brain and to our emotions and to everything that when we're in survival state for a really long time, we sometimes don't notice our hunger cues. We are like fueling on adrenaline. All of those things obviously are important for that saber-toothed tiger that's coming to attack us. So we really need to slow things down a little bit. Like take those deep breaths, have a little bit more awareness, do a grounding exercise, like whatever it is that you need to do, so then you can acknowledge that, ooh, okay, wow, maybe we need to take a little bit of a break. Maybe we need to take a step back. Maybe we need to pause this argument or this fight so I can go regulate, you go regulate, and then we can talk about it in maybe hopefully a way that's a little bit more proactive.
I love that you're pointing out how a big piece of this is the ability to notice. To notice that you're in the red zone, you're in the flooded zone, like thinking brain is offline, like trying to tune into what your cues are that's happening, or if you notice it in your partner too, right? But just general hint, don't tell your partner that you notice that they're flooded. It's not going to go well.
Not in that moment.
Not in that moment. So like noticing though that's happening is step number one. The ability to then take the space is another thing, and then what to do with that space is another thing. So we notice, okay, I'm in the red, something's going on. The reason why we want to take that space is back to the biology. When your prefrontal cortex is flipped, you're in that survival mode. The flooding that's happening is actually your brain is being flooded with, I think it's called neophedrine, which is like the stress hormone. And we know, like, through biology that it takes at least 20 minutes for that to clear out of your brain. Well, your brain is flooded with stress hormone, your prefrontal cortex isn't coming back on board. So at least a 20-minute break. For some folks who have experienced a lot of stress and anxiety in their lives, they might need a little bit longer to let all of that stress hormone recede and actually bring that part of their brain back on board that they can then have a good conversation with the other person. So as you're saying, noticing and then actually taking it, because we know it's a valid, important thing to do. And then what do we do in that space also, right? Because it can feel scary to take space when you're in an upset situation, especially if it's a high stakes relationship, really good friend or like your partner, like that's emotionally scary to take that space
too. It's so uncomfortable too, right? To just be sitting in that anxiety of what's going to happen. So just very, like I like how you pointed out those three separate things, right? Like acknowledging and reflecting that, being curious, noticing all of those things that, ooh, maybe we need to take a break. The act of actually taking a break, and then what am I doing during this break? Because I think something that a lot of people talk about is like they'll replay it. They're like, oh, I could have said this or I could have said that differently. the break is not an opportunity for you to think about, a comment that's going to cut a little deeper.
Or how to win.
Or how to win. It is really about just regulating yourself in that moment, being able to come back into your body, being able to allow that stress hormone to kind of, cool off and calm down. And that's what's going to benefit the situation as a whole, to be able to have that regulated space and then be able to be like, okay, whoa, what came up for me there? What triggered me? What impacted me? How was I feeling? Like, being able to kind of be curious now about our behavior and our emotions. And then we can go back and have a conversation that will most likely lead to somewhere a little bit more positive. Maybe sometimes situations can't get resolved in that moment, and that's okay. But at least maybe we can now have a different view of how we're going to go about this situation. But the break is really important. In the show How I Met Your Mother, there's Lily and Marshall, and they have a really great example of how to take those breaks. They pause their arguments. And so for anyone who has watched How I Met Your Mother, I'm sure you can recall the times where Lily and Marshall have paused an argument. And during that pause, sometimes they have the capacity to just kind of go about their day back to normal. They've gone out for dinner while they were on a pause break. But the most important thing is that you come back to it. And that's something that Lily and Marshall also do, is they unpause and they have the hard conversation. Mm-hmm. But it's the act of pausing and then making sure that you're coming back to it. Because going back to that withdrawer and pursuer, if somebody's pursuing and the person withdraws and leaves the argument
without saying when they're returning to the conversation,
exactly, or without saying, I'm feeling really overwhelmed, I need to take a break and I will be back in 20 minutes, that's just going to lead to more hurt
and more anxiety,
mm-hmm. and more conflict possibly down the road. So
I liked you sharing that story from the show that you were watching, because it's that's so real. And I would say that couple kind of sounds like a masterful couple if they're able to like totally just go out for dinner and enjoy each other and then come back to it. Like for me, that's a goal. I want to be able to get to that state of regulation where I can pause and then just switch modes and then come back to it.
I am no Lily and Marshall, and it's so funny because in the show they are like the relationship gurus. Like everyone goes to them for the relationship. But no, I don't think I'm there yet either, if I'm being completely honest. But it is a goal.
Yeah. So for most of us, that pause probably looks like, the Gottmans recommend leave the visual sphere of your partner or the person that you're in conflict with. Make sure you can't see each other, because if you can see each other, you're still probably attuning to each other. Yeah. You're kind of still in each other's energy space.
You're analyzing their behavior, what they're doing, if they care, all those things.
Yeah, you're still totally in their stuff, not in your stuff. So the goal is to like take the space to the distance what you need to be able to tune back into yourself. That means you need to leave the house to go for a walk. Do that, whatever it is. And then the idea is that in that space, you're doing something to the best of your ability that allows you to not think about the fight. And like that is so much easier said than done when you're activated. But if you can put in motion, the thing is going to be good for you before you're fully on board with it, whether it's like doing some stretches, going for a walk, listening to some music or a podcast, like do something to distract yourself from that fight fully. And that feels counterintuitive, but it just gives your brain a little bit of that space, because we're talking about the biology piece. We don't have to have it all figured out, just giving yourself the space to let those hormones settle down. And then, like you said, making sure that you've communicated to the other person that you're returning, and then return, because that builds trust.
Of course.
Yeah, one of the things that we haven't touched on yet too is that when we do return, and ideally we've got, our curious brain back at least a little bit, and then we can kind of get curious about the other person's perspective, right? And one of the ways to have those conversations, that's another piece of conflict resolution, is how do we say the things that need to be said. And that's where we start talking about I statements and naming our feelings as opposed to saying you, you know, or pointing out what we think our partner feels, right? Or the other person is thinking, like, because we don't actually know that, but we can start to disclose how we're feeling, and using those I statements really keeps it in the realm of I'm sharing with you something from myself as opposed to attacking. And then the other really big thing I think about in this is validation. Because to feel validated, even if you don't agree with the other person, to validate aspects of their experience is disarming. And so I think a lot of folks, this maybe it falls under misconceptions around conflict, think that, well, if I validate the other person, then they think that I agree with them or then I'm conceding my point. No. Like, we can validate other people's emotional experiences without agreeing with their take on something. And that's just about putting ourselves in their shoes and saying, hey, like, if I was you with your experiences, I would feel like that, and that hurts and that sucks, and I'm sorry you're feeling that way. That's not saying like, oh yeah, your interpretation of me was like, perfect. It's saying I can understand why you're feeling that way. And the more we're able to offer little bits of validation in a conflict conversation, it keeps it de-escalated and people feel a little bit more seen, a little bit more heard, which can help us all stay in the window of tolerance.
And you're also opening up the space of collaboration in that moment because you do feel seen and heard and not attacked. I think it's important. We mentioned I statements. And so I statements is when, like you mentioned, you really are focusing on yourself. I think a common example is the need for attention, which can sometimes be like attacking. Like, you're always on your phone. You never pay attention to me. You know, clearly have more important things to do than to listen to me. Instead of saying like, hey, I'm feeling upset because we're not connecting in a way that makes me feel comfortable or safe, or
how about even I want more attention.
That's communicating a need.
That's so vulnerable to say so directly. But it's a lot more disarming than you're always on your effing phone all the time. Like, those are going to elicit very different responses, ideally.
Very different, And so even being able to communicate that need, or like, I'm really needing attention, I'm, you know, feeling really lonely and isolated, and I would like for us to be together and without distraction. You're communicating what it is that you are feeling, your experience of it. And the person on the other end is, again, has an opportunity to validate, to hear you, to be like, yeah, I get you. I see where you're coming from. Let me finish this email and then we can sit together and we can talk. And then, you know, also, instead of being like, you're always on your freaking phone on Instagram or whatever, it's, oh wait, you were doing something for work. I'm going to allow you the time to finish that email because I know what's coming up next is going to be, we get to spend that time together. And it be without that distraction of you feeling like, oh, I really need to send that email, but I can't, right? So you're able to kind of communicate that, and that is, again, the person's going to respond in a much better way than you're always on your flipping phone. Right? That's going to bring up a lot of defenses and is going to lead to more conflict, or again, that pursuer withdrawer.
That reminds me of something that the Gottmans say, that they're always really good with exact percentages because they study this statistically. I can't remember what it is. Something like 97% of how a fight goes is determined in the first 3 minutes. It's how we open the dialogue with the other person that determines how that's going to go. So right from the beginning, before we are escalated, before any of that, we can be really mindful of how we approach the conversations in the first place, and using a lot of those I statements, naming our own needs and feelings as opposed to blaming, shaming, and you statements can be disarming at the beginning of a conflict. And, you know, it never hurts, especially in, you know, partnership situations, it never hurts to like keep on some nice things in those conversations. And something else the Gottmans say is like, if you can manage, and it feels weird and hard to imagine, but if you can manage 5 kind of positive mini interactions or validating statements or sweet affectionate moments in a conflict for every harsh thing that's said, it kind of balances things out.
Yeah.
So just small little things of like, I hear you, or like, you know, maybe touch their hand, like just little affirmative, positive interactions throughout a conflict can also keep everybody a little bit calmer. It can keep that flip from happening.
And connection.
Yeah.
Because all of the things that you just mentioned, it's I'm connecting with you. We can do this together instead of the disconnect of this is what I think, that's what you think. It's very separated.
Yeah.
And so I really do like that. Going to the house of conflict, you know, after going through the different types of conflict, what happens to our bodies, what happens to our chemistry when we are in a state of conflict, what are the hows? That's kind of where we started, and then we kind of went into this a little bit.
Yeah, I think like the house as I understand it thus far, and I'm like so on this journey of learning myself too. The first piece is starting out right, you know, bringing the issue to the table in as much of a, you know, self-ownership way, using those I statements, right? Being gentle, being kind when you're bringing it up, trying not to come in hot. If you're already hot, then do the cool off thing first.
Yeah.
So how we started, so kindly and really taking ownership of our feelings, right? And I'm just on that, I want to circle back quick to something you said about the, you know, if your partner say sending that work email and they're able to say, and you want attention, right? And they're able to say, okay, I'll attune to you in a second. Sometimes that's not even possible, right? Sometimes that person's need for attention can't get met. But having someone validate your feeling, even if they can't do the thing that day or whatever, even if it's a long-standing unsolvable argument in your relationship or your marriage, having someone say, I see you, I understand that you need and want more attention, it's something I want to work on, that itself is very disarming, even if it's, I can't do it right now, or I can't do it in 5 minutes, or I can't do it tonight. Like, just knowing that someone understands that that's a valid need. So I feel like, starting off gently and kindly, validating the other person's needs or asks or feelings is really important. Noticing if we're getting hyper or hypo aroused, so noticing our internal state. If we are, taking those pauses. When we coming back to trying to validate and stay kind and pepper in like positive affirmations and bids for connection throughout. I think all of those things go a long way. And knowing that not every argument, especially in long-term relationships or long-term friendships even, is solvable. We're not always going to have a solution. So one of the things that the Gottman say that I really love is that in one of those argument situations, the goal isn't necessarily to solve the problem, it's to have a positive experience with conflict where you become closer as a couple or as friends due to how you heard each other and validated each other and showed each other that you care and that you're curious, so that you actually win together. Even if you haven't solved the issue, you feel like you have more understanding.
It's focusing less on the outcome and more on like the process.
Yeah, and maintaining the relationship in a good way. Yeah, because some of these fights you might have for 40 years. You know, so just making sure that you can do those in a kind way that actually helps you learn about the other person, then that's not necessarily a terrible thing.
Yeah, this doesn't fit for everybody because everybody is different. But for me and my partner, when we are in conflict, sometimes, again, and I think obviously being mindful and acknowledging where your partner is at, but humor can be a good icebreaker in an argument, and it can kind of simmer everyone down. And that can just be that moment of, ooh, okay, now that we're simmered down, like, let's have a more, you know, constructive conversation about this now that we have had like the little break of laughing together. And so I find a lot of the times when me and my husband have like any kind of argument or conflict, he is so funny. So even if I'm so mad, I'm like, oh damn it, you're so funny. And so I'm laughing, and that disarms the conflict a little bit. It does create more space to be like, thanks for making me laugh, but I'm still not okay with this. Like, let's figure this out together. And so knowing, obviously, time and place, timing, knowing your partner, knowing the person on the receiving end of humor can be something that can be helpful in that situation. I think that's a really like gentle way to disarm an argument.
I love humor. And yeah, the Gottman's name, that is one of those 5 things that you can do that brings some positive interaction into conflict.
Yeah.
My favorite type of humor in an argument is if you are self-aware enough that you know kind of your crappy patterns. If you can kind of make fun of yourself a little bit to your partner, like, yes, for me, I'm like, I'm so stubborn. Like, I know, I am so sorry. I'm so bullheaded sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's like letting your partner know that, like, I know I can be like this, and we can laugh about it a little bit, can go a long way to establishing some trust and peace.
Yeah, but the acknowledgement too is going to be better coming from you than for your partner to be like, my God, you're so stubborn. You're going to like, excuse me?
Yeah, I may know that about myself, but you are not allowed to tell me that, actually.
Yeah, the acknowledgement of it does, again, bring the focus in it where, you know, you brought it up, and if your partner's like, yeah, you are, it can be like a comical moment.
Yes.
But then, yeah, just kind of simmers things down.
And it's nice to feel accepted for even kind of your crappy traits, you know? For someone to be like, yeah, I know that about you. I'm still here for this conversation.
Yeah.
That's nice.
That is really nice. One thing I do with couples too is making a list of fighting fair rules, because fighting, conflict, it's going to happen, but we can do it in a way that doesn't hurt the other person. And so, you know, fighting fair, you can sit with your partner and talk a little bit about, you know, what are some things that we don't want to do to each other. So maybe not bringing in an argument from like 5 years ago into this one, really trying to focus on being present, or being able to communicate the need for breaks, coming up with like, you know, a funny word, like maybe pineapples means we need to take a break, or pause, like in the show, being able to just have that awareness and acknowledgement, and something you both plan together so that you're able to do that and both of you be on like agreeing to these rules. I think that that's helpful too.
Okay, just side note, pineapple is actually my safe word in conflict, really? So I can't believe you just said that.
That's fine, or watermelon.
Because highly unlikely that we're actually fighting about pineapples.
Exactly. That's a good one though. But yeah, come up with the, like, be playful with some of those rules as well. But yeah, I think definitely curiosity, being, you know, curious about how you're being impacted in those certain moments, being able to validate, communicate your emotions in a way that isn't attacking the other person. So focusing more on you, those I statements.
Those I statements are related to the willingness to be vulnerable too, right? So if you're in a trusting and loving relationship, the willingness to forefront the vulnerability by asking for what you need directly or naming your feelings, which is, you know, that's a big step for a lot of us.
It is, yeah. So being able to do that, and then just being mindful of your window of tolerance. What do you need to take a break? What do you need to kind of reflect and, you know, regulate yourself in those moments, and being able to communicate that with your partner, I think is the biggest thing. Don't go walking away from an argument or a conflict and be like, this is what we're supposed to do. It's part of that communication. Hey, I'm feeling overstimulated right now. I need to take a break. Or, hey, this isn't helpful. We're both really heated in this moment. Maybe we both need to take this break and cool off, and then we can come back in 20 minutes later today, whatever it is.
Pineapple.
Watermelon. Exactly. Yeah. Is there any last thoughts you want to share for people?
If anything, just know that conflict is normal. Yeah. It doesn't mean anything is terrible. Lots and lots of couples and people have tendencies to go to what we quote unquote call toxic. Now, in terms of when they're in conflict, doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means let's look at that. Let's work on that. So if you find that you're one of those people that does get really escalated or says really hurtful things or whatever, or withdraws and shuts down, and you're listening to this and going, oh no, I do those things, is very normal. And it's something to get curious about.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Jenni, for being here. We'll include links in our show notes for some of the resources that we shared today. And Jenni will also be having a workshop virtually where she will be going through the different conflict styles with folks. So if you are interested in hearing and learning more about conflict, please check our show notes for those dates for the virtual workshop.
Yeah, I would love to have some of you there. I think it'd be great.
Well, thank you so much again, Jenni, and thanks everyone for tuning in again.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Outside the Therapy Room. this podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you reside in Ontario and are interested in working with one of our therapists, please visit our website in the show notes. If you reside outside of Ontario, a quick Google search or search through Psychology Today will help you find a therapist near you.